Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It always amazes me how people can make cruelty sound like a joke if they smile wide enough when they say it. My father stood at the head of the dining room table, fork in hand, eyes gleaming with pride, and said the words as though he were delivering a toast that would be remembered for years. "Well," he chuckled, raising his glass just slightly, "we bought your brother a car this year. Figured he deserved something nice for all his hard work. You can always take the bus, sweetheart." The laughter that followed wasn't loud or forced. It was casual, easy, the kind of laugh that comes from people so comfortable in their own hierarchy they don't even realize they're laughing at someone else's expense. My brother, of course, sat there grinning like he'd just won a game he didn't even have to play. He reached over to our mother, who looked at him with that familiar soft glow in her eyes, the one she reserved only for him, like he was still the golden boy who could do no wrong. She patted his hand, nodded at my father's comment like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, and said, "He's earned it. He's always been responsible with his money, unlike some people." She didn't need to say my name. She never did. It hung in the air like a ghost, floating between the mashed potatoes and the wine glasses. I didn't say anything. I didn't flinch, didn't roll my eyes, didn't offer a snide comeback or force a smile to keep the peace. I just kept cutting my roast chicken, calmly, methodically, as if I hadn't just been publicly reminded that I was still the family afterthought, the one who never got the same consideration, the one whose accomplishments never counted because they didn't come with a bow or a price tag they could brag about at the country club. They didn't know I'd seen the car in the driveway when I arrived, shiny, brand new, not even the dealership tag removed yet. They didn't know I'd stood there for a moment staring at it, letting the cold air fill my lungs while I reminded myself to stay composed. I knew it was coming. I knew what this day would be. I'd known it weeks ago when my mother called to remind me to bring something nice to wear. "Your brother's going to have a special moment." I had smiled through the phone and said I would. And then I had hung up and added one more item to my bag, an envelope, simple and unassuming, but heavy with the kind of weight no one at that table was prepared to feel. That morning, before the chaos of dinner and the carefully wrapped gifts and the pre-rehearsed lines of affection, I had made myself a cup of coffee in my quiet apartment. I had sat by the window and watched the snow fall in soft spirals, letting the silence settle around me like a coat I'd grown used to wearing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even bitter in the way I used to be when I was younger, when every slight from my parents felt like a dagger, when every praise they gave my brother felt like another notch carved into my self-worth. I was past that now, or at least I told myself I was. But even so, I couldn't help but remember all the Christmases before this one. The year they bought my brother a laptop while I got a candle set from the clearance rack. The year he got a gym membership and I got socks. The year they spent a fortune on his college tuition while telling me community college was probably a more realistic path for someone like you. I had swallowed those moments whole, buried them under polite smiles and quiet sighs, but they had never really gone away. They just sank deeper into my bones, layering themselves one over the other until I wasn't sure if what I felt anymore was resentment or simply resignation. This year, though, I wasn't here to pretend. I wasn't here to sit quietly and absorb their selective generosity while they praised my brother like he was the second coming of Christ. I wasn't here to nod and smile while they handed him gifts wrapped in silver and handed me reminders that I should just be grateful to be included. No, this year I had brought something different. Something they didn't see coming. Something that didn't come with ribbon or bows, but carried far more impact than anything under the tree. I didn't say anything. Not yet. But I brought something with me, and they had no idea what was inside that envelope. There are certain truths you don't fully understand when you're a child, but you feel them all the same, like the way a room can shift its energy the moment someone else walks in, or how your accomplishments somehow feel smaller when someone else's name is mentioned immediately after yours. For as far back as I can remember, it's always been him. My brother has always been the center of gravity in our household, the one everything and everyone revolved around. He didn't just occupy space, he commanded it effortlessly, and everyone else was expected to orbit quietly without complaint. Even as kids, the difference in how we were treated was never subtle. It was glaring and constant, wrapped in carefully worded excuses and the kind of praise that felt like a script everyone else had memorized except for me. When he brought home a certificate for Most Improved Reader, my parents had it framed and hung in the hallway like it was a Pulitzer. When I brought home a regional writing award, my mother smiled politely, nodded, and said, "That's sweet, honey. You've always had your little creative streak." I remember the day he got his first bike. Red, shiny, expensive. He hadn't even asked for it, but my dad wheeled it out into the yard like he was presenting a grand prize, telling my brother, "This is what hard work looks like," even though the boy hadn't lifted a finger for it. I stood there on the porch in my scuffed sneakers, watching the scene play out like a movie I wasn't cast in, knowing deep down that there would be no surprise gift for me, no moment of praise or recognition. And when I eventually got a hand-me-down bicycle, 2 years later, rusted at the edges and squeaky with every push, I was told I should be grateful. "He's a boy," my mother would often say, her voice soft but unwavering. "He'll carry the family legacy one day." As if gender alone was a golden ticket, as if my presence was incidental, a placeholder until something more important came along. That phrase followed me through every stage of life, echoing through the walls of our house like a mantra. "He's a boy. He needs more. You need to understand." But I didn't understand. Not really. I tried to convince myself there was logic behind it, some greater purpose I just hadn't grown into yet. I told myself that maybe one day it would even out, that eventually my efforts would be seen for what they were. But as the years went by, and the scales never tipped, something inside me began to harden, not into hatred, not even anger, but into a quiet, deliberate sense of detachment. I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped chasing their approval like it was oxygen. I stopped thinking that if I just worked a little harder, they might finally look at me the way they looked at him. Have you ever grown up in a family where you felt like your role was already written for you before you even had a chance to speak? Where you were expected to clap for others but never shine yourself? Where every small win you had was dismissed as luck, and every stumble you made was proof you weren't trying hard enough? If you have, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment if you've ever been the invisible one at your own dinner table, the one who was told to smile through disappointment, to understand, to accept, to be quiet. My brother was always handed the mic, and I was handed the chore list. He was the one our parents invested in, the one they believed in, the one they groomed for greatness, while I was told to stay practical, to find something stable, to aim just high enough that I wouldn't fall too hard. I remember once, in high school, when I was nominated for an art scholarship, something I'd poured my heart into for years. When I told my parents, they glanced at each other before saying, "That's great, sweetie, but have you thought about getting a real degree in something you can actually use?" The first signs of bitterness crept in then, not loud or volatile, but slow and steady, like ivy wrapping around stone. I knew I'd never win their approval on their terms. And so I stopped trying to. I didn't slam doors or scream through dinners. I didn't rebel or beg or try to prove anything anymore. I just quietly redirected all that energy inward and onward. I began to build, not loudly, not with banners and fanfare, but silently and relentlessly. I didn't want to be their favorite anymore. I wanted to be free. And while they were busy raising their golden boy, I was quietly building an empire they didn't even know they relied on. People like to say success is a ladder, but what they never tell you is that sometimes you're building that ladder while everyone else is climbing when they didn't even build themselves. My path was never straight, and it sure as hell wasn't paved. It was made of gravel, broken boards, cracked concrete, and every inch of it I built on my own, piece by piece, while the people around me pretended not to notice. While they nodded at my brother's every move like he was God's gift to ambition and rolled their eyes anytime I even mentioned I was working on something new. My early 20s were held together by takeout containers, late nights, overdrawn accounts, and part-time jobs that didn't pay enough to cover groceries, let alone dreams. I worked in coffee shops where customers didn't know my name and didn't care to learn it, babysat for couples who treated me like a glorified doormat, took odd jobs writing content for startup websites in exchange for checks that sometimes bounced. I scraped together tuition payments dollar by dollar, sold old clothes online to buy textbooks, and stayed up all night teaching myself things others paid thousands to learn. I built knowledge from scraps, experience from rejection, and discipline from sheer necessity. There was no applause, no guiding hand, no safety net under me. There was only grit, stubbornness, and the quiet fire of knowing that if I didn't figure it out myself, no one would come to save me. But even then, even when I was doing everything right just to survive, my parents still talked about me like I was wasting time chasing fairy tales. "She's creative," my mom would say with a smile that was far too tight to be sincere. "She's still finding herself." Finding myself? I was building something they couldn't even comprehend. I didn't tell anyone when I registered my first business license. I didn't mention the late nights I spent learning how to negotiate contracts, set up client systems, or automate workflows. I didn't say a word when my first client came on board, not because I wasn't proud, but because I knew they wouldn't care. I started from my tiny apartment, working off a second-hand laptop with a cracked screen and a phone that barely held a charge. I invested every penny back into the business, skipped vacations, wore the same 3 outfits, and told people I was freelancing, because that was easier than explaining I was building a company from nothing. And while my family was still treating me like the girl who would eventually grow out of her hobbies, I was quietly expanding. Slowly, steadily, I moved from 1 client to 3, from 3 to 10, until one day I looked at my bank account and realized I had more money saved than I'd ever imagined possible just a few years earlier. I had systems in place, contractors under my wing, processes running smoothly, and yet I still kept it all to myself. Not because I wanted to hide, but because I didn't want my progress twisted into something small by people who only saw value in things they could recognize. The real irony came a year later, when my parents announced they were refinancing their home to consolidate some debts and free up funds for house improvements. What they didn't know, what they still don't know, is that the local bank managing the refinance is one I quietly invested in 2 years ago through a holding company I co-founded. I don't sit on the board, but I own a percentage of the institution that approved their loan. Their house was refinanced on my terms, with my silent signature buried in the investor documents. And it didn't stop there. My father's side business, the one he always talks about like it's the next big thing, the one he dips into whenever he needs to cover unexpected expenses, is funded through a capital account that traces back to an anonymous investment vehicle I created. Every time he pulls funds from that account, he's unknowingly using money that I channeled there through carefully structured allocations. He thought he got lucky with a generous angel investor his accountant connected him with. He never once stopped to ask who that investor really was. He never even wondered where the money kept coming from or why the terms were so favorable. He just accepted it like he always has, assuming that somehow things would always work out for him because they always have. But they work out because I make sure they do. I've watched him boast about how things are turning around, how smart business decisions pay off, and I've nodded quietly, never once correcting him, never once reminding him that without me, his business would have folded 6 months ago. And I've watched my mother continue treating me like the daughter who never quite figured it out, even while unknowingly spending dividends generated by the portfolio I built from scratch. I had every chance to stop helping them. I could have pulled the plug, closed the tap, and walked away without ever looking back. But I didn't. Not yet. I was waiting for the right moment. The sound of silverware scraping against porcelain echoed like a quiet rhythm beneath the familiar hum of small talk and self-congratulation. As the dinner table conversation once again returned to the only topic my parents ever seemed capable of celebrating, my brother. He sat there like a king in a paper crown, basking in their praise, his voice smooth with that practiced confidence he'd worn for years, listing off his new job benefits, his promotion prospects, and the performance bonus he'd probably be getting by spring. My mother clung to every word like gospel, nodding with wide eyes and beaming smiles, while my father chuckled at all the right moments, clearly reveling in the image of a son he could proudly parade through any social circle without a second thought. And me? I sat at the far end of the table, carefully folding my napkin in my lap, listening, absorbing, observing, calm as ever, quiet as usual, but not because I lacked something to say. I simply knew that nothing I said would matter in their world unless it came with a price tag or a headline. And even then, if it wasn't attached to my brother's name, they'd still find a way to minimize it. That's what they'd always done. After all, disguise favoritism as tradition, wrap bias in thin layers of politeness, and tell me I was imagining it any time I pushed back. I had spent my entire life sitting at tables like this one, pretending the food tasted better than it did, pretending the words didn't sting as much as they did, pretending I wasn't drowning in the silence that always followed whenever I dared to contribute something meaningful. But this year, I wasn't pretending anymore. I was simply waiting for the moment they gave me the last little push I needed to open that envelope sitting quietly in my purse like a loaded weapon dressed in stationery. It didn't take long. My father, after pouring himself another generous glass of wine, leaned back in his chair with a smug kind of satisfaction that seemed to fill the entire room. He looked around the table, eyes finally landing on me, not with warmth or affection, but with that familiar mix of superiority and amusement he always reserved for moments when he wanted to remind me where I stood in the family. "Of course," he said loudly, raising his glass slightly, "we're so proud of your brother. New car, new job, he's really doing something with his life. But hey, sweetie, you can always take the bus, right?" Laughter. Quiet at first, then a few polite chuckles, followed by my mother placing a hand on his arm as if to say, "That's enough." But her smile betrayed the truth. She thought it was funny, too. They always did. And just like that, the moment had arrived, wrapped not in drama, but in perfect predictability. I reached into my purse with a measured calmness, pulled out the envelope I had sealed just that morning, and slid it across the table toward my father's plate. No words, no theatrics, just the simple gesture of paper meeting tablecloth. The room stilled. Conversation ceased. Even my brother paused mid-bite, his fork hovering in the air like he sensed something had shifted but wasn't sure yet what it was. My father raised an eyebrow, clearly confused, but intrigued enough to open the envelope without hesitation. His fingers pulled the letter out slowly, unfolding it with the same care he might use for an old newspaper article or a bill he already intended to ignore. And then, as his eyes scanned the words on the page, his entire expression changed, not dramatically, not explosively, but with a subtle, dawning horror that spread across his face like a shadow. The letter was formal, concise, and impossible to misinterpret. It was a termination notice for his revolving business credit line, the one he'd been using to prop up his side venture, the one he thought had been extended by some faceless banker with poor judgment and generous risk tolerance. Except it hadn't. The loan had been underwritten only because of a silent third-party guarantor, me. My capital backing had made the entire deal possible. And now, that capital had been withdrawn. The funding was over. Effective immediately. At the bottom of the letter, beneath the banking terms in fine print, was my signature. He looked up at me slowly, still trying to process what he was holding. My mother leaned over to see the letter for herself, her lips parting slightly as she scanned the contents with disbelief. My brother stared, utterly frozen, like someone had just revealed a twist ending to a story he thought he already knew by heart. I leaned forward slightly, not to gloat, not to rub it in, but because I wanted them to hear me clearly, every word, every syllable, without room for misunderstanding. "That loan," I said, voice steady and low, "was only ever possible because of my financial backing. My name was never on the paperwork, but my money was behind every approval you got. That's over now." Silence. The kind that's too thick to breathe in, the kind that says everything words can't. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even blinked. I smiled, not out of cruelty, but because it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in years. "So congratulations on the car," I said quietly, pushing my chair back from the table. "Let me know how you plan to keep it without me." The silence that followed my words didn't just fill the room, It swallowed it whole, settling over the table like a thick, suffocating fog that no one knew how to clear. My father stared at the letter in his hands as if it might somehow change its contents if he looked hard enough, his mouth slightly open, but no words coming out. Just a kind of stunned disbelief that didn't quite fit the man who'd spent his life pretending he had control over everything. My brother, for once in his charmed life, was completely still, no smug grin, no sarcastic quip, just wide, unblinking eyes and a look on his face like someone had just pulled the rug out from under his entire understanding of how the world worked. My mother was the first to move. She reached across the table toward the letter like maybe if she could touch it, she'd better understand it, better control it, maybe even pretend it wasn't real. But the words on that page were far more permanent than anything she could erase with denial or deflection. She scanned the letter quickly, and I watched her expression shift from confusion to something sharper, some blend of shock, embarrassment, and a sudden awareness that the daughter she had spent a lifetime minimizing had just upended the family dynamic in one simple gesture. Still, no one said anything. So I did. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I didn't try to turn it into a scene. I simply sat there, calm and composed, and told them the truth they had never bothered to ask about, not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because I wanted them to finally understand. "You've spent years assuming I was the failure in this family," I said, my voice steady and quiet, but clear enough to cut through every piece of stunned silence in that room. "You thought because I didn't talk about my work or show off my success the way Nick did, it meant I didn't have any." I paused, not for dramatic effect, but because I wanted them to sit with that sentence for a moment, to feel the weight of their assumptions finally pressing back against them. "You thought my business was just some side hustle. You thought my life was small, insignificant, and unworthy of attention. You've spent years praising him and ignoring me, and you never once stopped to consider that maybe you had no idea who I actually was." My mother blinked rapidly, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the tablecloth like it could steady her somehow. "But why didn't you ever tell us?" she asked, her voice soft and defensive, as if this was somehow a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right amount of maternal concern. "Why didn't you say anything?" I looked straight at her when I answered, my words colder than I intended, but more honest than anything I'd ever spoken to her. "Because you never asked. You never cared enough to ask. You just assumed I was failing. You assumed I needed guidance or pity or advice I never asked for. You assumed I wasn't capable, that I wasn't enough, that I was just a background character in the story of your favorite child." There was no fire in my tone, no screaming or drama, just truth laid bare, raw and unflinching. I wanted them to feel it, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I wanted them to finally understand how deep the divide really was. My entire adult life had been shaped by their disregard, by their inability to see beyond the version of me they had locked into place when I was a teenager who liked books more than basketball, art more than economics, and who never learned how to be loud enough to matter in a house where volume was mistaken for value. My brother finally spoke then, but his voice was quiet and uncertain, nothing like the confident tone he usually carried through rooms like a badge of honor. "So all this time," he said, still staring at the letter, "you were the one keeping everything afloat?" I nodded, not because I needed him to validate it, but because it was the truth. "Yes, and you had no idea. None of you did. Because none of you ever saw me clearly." The irony wasn't lost on me, that for years they had overlooked me while I was quietly carrying the very weight they assumed belonged to him, that they had praised his surface-level accomplishments while living on the foundation I had built for them in silence, that they had called me aimless while leaning on my success without even knowing it. But this moment, this awkward, fractured, uncomfortable moment, wasn't about revenge, not entirely, at least. It wasn't about punishing them for their blindness or finally making them grovel at my feet. It was about something deeper, something more personal than revenge could ever satisfy. I didn't do this for revenge. I did it to finally be seen. The air outside was colder than I remembered, sharp and biting against my cheeks, but it felt more like a reset than a discomfort, like something heavy had finally lifted off my shoulders after carrying it far longer than I ever should have. I didn't walk out of that house with some grand sense of triumph or revenge humming in my veins, because it wasn't about winning. It wasn't about watching them squirm or basking in the silence that followed my truth. It was about peace. It was about finally stepping into the version of myself I'd been becoming for years, quietly, deliberately, and unapologetically. I walked down the front steps slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel path, the glow of the porch light stretching long shadows across the yard. Behind me, the noise inside the house had shifted into the kind of awkward murmurs people use when they don't know how to rewrite the script they've been reciting for decades. I didn't need to hear the details. I knew exactly what was happening in that living room, my mother probably still staring at the letter like it might rearrange itself if she squinted hard enough, my father's pride cracking quietly under the weight of a truth he could no longer ignore, and my brother's ego twisting into knots as he tried to reframe the story he'd built his identity around. I was halfway to my car when I heard the door swing open behind me and the sound of hurried footsteps crunching down the same path I had just walked. I didn't have to turn around to know it was my brother. His voice followed a second later, strained and uneven, not angry exactly, but confused and maybe just a little desperate. "Did you plan this?" he asked, and when I turned to face him, I could see the question wasn't rhetorical, it was real. His eyes searched mine like he was hoping for some softer version of the truth, one that might dull the sting of what had just unfolded. I looked at him for a long moment before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to make sure he really heard me this time, not the way he used to hear me, half listening with his ego in the way, but really hear me like a man standing face to face with the limits of everything he thought he knew. "Some lessons," I said calmly, "can't be taught with kindness." He blinked, absorbing it slowly, and then his expression hardened the way it always did when he felt cornered. "So this was about humiliating me," he said, jaw tightening, arms crossed like he was still trying to armor himself with indignation. "You wanted to make me look stupid in front of everyone." I shook my head slowly, a quiet laugh slipping from my throat, not cruel, not mocking, just exhausted from the effort it took for him to always see things in such narrow terms. "I didn't humiliate you," I said simply. "I let you see the truth. What you do with it is up to you." He didn't respond right away. His face twisted slightly, a flicker of something behind his eyes that looked a lot like shame, but I didn't wait for it to settle. I turned and walked the rest of the way to my car, not because I was done with him, but because I was finally done trying to fix a story that was never mine to begin with. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and let the quiet hum of it fill the space between thought and relief. As I pulled out of the driveway, my phone buzzed softly from the console beside me. I reached over to glance at the screen, expecting some trivial notification or an automated update, but the message waiting there made my breath catch just a little in my chest. It was from one of the firms I'd pitched to earlier in the year, a company so high up the ladder I had almost convinced myself they'd forgotten my name. The message was short and to the point. "We've reviewed your proposal. Our board is impressed. We'd like to discuss offering you an executive role in the new year." I smiled, just slightly, just to myself, not because of the offer, but because the timing felt poetic in a way that only life's strangest moments ever do. I didn't respond right away. I wanted to sit with it for a while, let it settle in my bones the same way the cold night air had settled into my lungs. I wasn't chasing validation anymore, but I wasn't about to deny the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing everything I'd built was finally speaking for itself. Back inside the house, I imagined my father still sitting at the table, envelope in hand, letter unfolded beside his untouched dinner, staring at it like it had betrayed him. But the truth is, it hadn't betrayed him at all. It had just told him what he had refused to see for too long, that I wasn't a disappointment, or a background character, or the daughter who never quite figured it out. I was the foundation they never realized they were standing on. I wasn't trying to ruin Christmas. I was just tired of pretending I didn't matter.